In this lesson, we will learn about exception handling. During the execution of a program, problem might happen, and Java will throw exception when those problem arises. Exception occur for many different reasons. For examples, a user has entered invalid data. A file that needs to be opened cannot be found. A database connection has been lost. Java has run out of memory. There are two categories of exceptions: checked and runtime or unchecked exception. Checked exceptions typically caused by user error or a problem that cannot be foreseen by the programmer. For example, if a file is to be opened cannot be found, an exception occurs. These exceptions must be handled at the time of coding, before the program compiles. Runtime exceptions is also known as unchecked exception. Runtime exception can be avoided by doing more checks. It is ignored at the time of coding and compilation. This is the specification of exception class from Java website. Exception class is the superclass for all type of Java exception. The specification here lists down all the direct subclasses of exception class in Java. This is the specification of runtime exception class from Java website. Runtime exception is the child of exception, and it is an unchecked exception. This is the exception class hierarchy. On the top is the throwable class, and is inherited by an error class and exception class. Exception class is inherited by runtime exception and many other classes like IO exception. Those exception classes in blue are checked exception, and those exception classes in red are unchecked exception. Checked exception must be handled in the codes. Runtime exception, unchecked exception, and error need not be handled in the codes. However, we can choose to handle runtime exception and the codes too. We don't usually handle error in the codes. Error occur in case of severe failures, which almost are not possible to be handled in the codes. Errors are generated to indicate errors generated by the runtime environment. Example: JVM is out of memory. Normally programs cannot recover from errors. A program can be designed to process an exception in one of the three ways. First way: do not handle the exception at all. Second way: handle the exception where it occurs. Third way: handle the exception at another point in the program by propagating the exception. To handle an exception where it occurs, a try-catch block is placed around the code that might generate an exception. Code within a try-catch block is referred to as protected code, and the syntax for using try-catch looks like the following. A try block with protected code, and a catch block indicating the exception to be caught, and the code to handle the exception. The first exception that we will learn is file not found exception. File not found exception is a type of IO exception and it is also a checked exception. A checked exception means that any codes that throw this exception must handle this exception. File not found exception is thrown by the scanner class when we use a scanner to read in a file. Practice time. First, code this example without the file. Student marks DAT. After that, create the file student marks DAT with marks. Test the difference between these two scenarios. Pause the video and code this example. The next exception that we will learn is array index out of bound exception. This exception is thrown when we use an invalid index to access an element in the array. Array index out of bound exception is a type of runtime exception, and it is also an unchecked exception. An unchecked exception means there is no need to handle this exception, but we can choose to handle it. Practice time. Pause the video and code this example. You should get an array index out of bound exception. The next exception that we will learn is input mismatch exception. This exception is thrown when we use scanner to read in an integer from keyboard, but the user enter a string instead. Input mismatch exception is a type of runtime exception, and it is also an unchecked exception. Practice time. Pause the video and code this example. First, run the program and enter a valid integer. Then run the program and enter a string. You should get an input mismatch exception. The next exception that we will learn is number format exception. If the string is not a valid integer, it will throw number format exception. This exception is thrown when we use an integer class parseInteger method to parse a string to an integer. Input mismatch exception is a type of runtime exception, and it is also an unchecked exception. Practice time. Pause the video and code this example. First, run the program and enter a valid integer. Then run the program and enter a string. You should get an input mismatch exception. The next exception that we will learn is null pointer exception. This exception is thrown when we try to call a method from a variable which is null. Null pointer exception is a type of runtime exception, and it is also an unchecked exception. Practice time. Pause the video and code this example. You should get a null pointer exception when loop counter I reaches 2. If a method does not handle a checked exception, the method must declare it using the throws keyword. The throws keyword appears at the end of a method's signature. A method can throws more than one exceptions. In this case, the exceptions are declared in a list separated by commas.